Alrighty, Eddie, thank you so much for sitting down and coming off your busy last campaign weekend of the primary, right?
Absolutely, Vaughn.
And thanks for sitting down. Really appreciate talking to you and talking to all the other candidates today.
Yeah.
So we sat down about a year ago.
Can't even believe it's been that long. Oh my!
As all this was getting going. So just in an overview sense, a year of touring the district, meeting people, and just hearing everything that's out there. What are some of your main takeaways of what you've seen?
Well, this district itself is incredibly diverse in terms of the things that it needs and the people that we have. You know, as you go across the western to eastern part, you recognize that, you know, people need to not only be able to put food on the table for a lot of the families, but they're also concerned about the environment and making sure that we've got natural resources for our kids and several generations going down the line. So as we've been knocking on doors, we've been hearing a lot of the same things, that this area, this district has been cut off from the rest of New York State and the rest of the nation. And they're looking for a representative that's actually going to listen to what they need and act on it.
Mm-hmm. Is there one issue, it's hard to pin down one,
Sure.
But is there one that kind of sticks out to you through all your journeys across the district, something that maybe you weren't expecting to hear as much, that really caught your eye, and something that you really think you can proactively pursue should you be elected to Congress?
So I think the biggest issue that we've heard across the district has been about jobs. Being able to make sure that we stop outsourcing our jobs, to make sure that we really work on making sure that we've got 21st century jobs here and good infrastructure. So we hear that all across the district. You know, no matter where you're from, people are concerned about bringing young folks back and making sure that we have a good quality job and a good quality life. Mm-hmm. I will also say the one thing you asked about, what kind of surprised me, one of the issues, is the amount of people that are pushing for more government transparency and more government accountability. That's been a big thing, especially in this recent administration. You know, the push to make sure that we know where money's coming from for our politicians and how they are acting and where their funding is. That's been really important. A lot of folks have said we have had an unclear administration, both in Congress and with the president, on just knowing what they have, right? And this big push to just keep everything secret. We should have a government that's transparent, accountable, and responsive, and we don't have that.
Mm-hmm. Now, your jobs program, I know you released a plan, a written out plan that's probably a few months ago during the campaign.
Yes.
What are some of the pillars and main points that you see that you would be able to pursue within the House in Congress?
Well, I'm proud to be the only candidate in the Democratic primary so far to release policy. And I think that's important because we've seen what's happened to have a representative for the past 7 years with no plan for jobs in this district. So the tenets of my plan, actually, we've really been focused on improving and increasing opportunity to 21st century jobs, first and foremost. So having trade-skilled programs in our schools, having them through our unions and through our community colleges. I think another part of that is really focused on creating a reinvestment bank in this nation that would take billions and billions of dollars for municipalities to go and take those funds and rebuild our roads, our bridges, create municipal broadband collectives across the nation and across this district. And on top of that, a new tax basis. So a tax repatriation, being able to take the taxation and the funds from a corporation and tax them on a worldwide basis, not just a U.S. basis. So we've seen a lot of corporations holding their money in accounts overseas. Mm-hmm. And what we want to do is create a tax that includes those, so that we're able to bring that money back to the U.S. and start to rebuild what we've got.
Mm-hmm. Now, I do want to dig into the tax issue on a broader sense.
Sure,
you brought
absolutely.
up an interesting topic with the tax repatriation.
Yeah.
So some of that tried to occur, if I'm correct, within the tax plan passed last year, but there's been a lot of complexity.
Yes.
It's a very difficult thing to do.
Yes.
What are how would you build upon existing efforts to try and repatriate companies that have shipped their taxes to places like the islands?
Yeah, so I think it's very difficult, but we've got to provide those businesses the opportunity to just tell us what they've got, right? And the biggest thing that we've seen with the new tax bill is that you're absolutely right. there are issues with trying to instill that. But we need to make sure that when we write our tax law that we are focusing on an overall corporate-wide repatriation. So that we say, instead of just having these very specific rules, we say anything that you're making, whether that's here in the US or worldwide, you have that percentage tax. And we want to encourage our corporations to not only tell us what they're making, but also bring businesses back here to the US. And I think what we need to do is, first off, get rid of this tax plan that we have and start to have a well-written tax plan where we actually do have congressional hearings. We talk about how much the corporate tax is going to be and how we plan on using those funds.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, it's a big plan, but are there parts of it that you do like, that you do appreciate, or would you repeal the whole thing?
So my biggest problem with No problem. My biggest problem with the tax plan, and this is something I have a problem with Representative Reed about, is that we always say, hey, these individuals across this district are getting an extra bump in their paycheck every week. But it doesn't address salaries across this nation. What we've seen is stagnation in salaries and annualized pay stay the same for over 10 years. And just a small bonus isn't going to help the problem. So what we need to do is get rid of the whole thing and start to have congressional hearings to really focus on how we can represent the most people under a tax plan.
Mm-hmm. So what does something like a federal income tax bracket layout look like in a plan that would do more things like raise wages?
Yeah. So I think what we're looking at first and foremost right now is we've seen tax brackets that are giving the wealthiest 1% a huge tax break, right? I don't have the specific breakdowns that I can give you, and I'd love to do that. But I think what we need to do is just start to talk to the experts across our nation and start to create a tax plan that does work for the majority of people. One that focuses on allowing corporations to increase wages and gives them opportunities to do so. One that focuses on making sure that instead of bonuses, we're talking about providing benefits for individuals. Mm-hmm. So that's really big on my tax plan checklist of things.
Mm-hmm. Now, somebody on the more conservative side, like Representative Reed, might argue that lowering the taxes on corporations allows those corporations more flexibility to raise wages. What would be your response to that?
Well, I think
that idea.
Well, first off, I'm okay with lowering the corporate tax. I think that's something that we can do. The problem that we've seen under this tax bill is they haven't increased jobs and they haven't increased wages. Instead, they've done shareholder buybacks. So there's a lack of incentive there. Even though they're reducing the corporate tax, what we've seen is completely the opposite. The corporations and businesses are spending more on their shareholders than they are their actual workers.
Mm-hmm. And how does that translate down to New York State? The New York State has to, had to address coupling and decoupling coupling the tax codes. Is that something that state lawmakers really need to take a harder look at and address state level taxes to go along with it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that whenever you have federal tax policy, we also have to engage the states because it is important because they go hand in hand, especially when we're looking at state and local tax deductions. It's important that we are engaging folks for that. Mm-hmm. But what we've seen under this tax plan is just a complete disregard for many states in this nation, including New York. We've had a representative who was at odds with the governor and refused to even work with him to try to find a reasonable solution under this tax bill. And that's simply unacceptable. No matter what party you are, we need to work with one another in order to make this the best tax bill or even legislation that would work both federally and state.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right. I want to kind of shift gears into one sector, the ag sector in the district, specifically dairy farmers. I know across the district we have a number of dairy farmers who have been struggling lately under low prices.
Yeah.
Have you looked into the issue a lot? And if so, what are some ideas you might have in Washington that might help some of the struggling dairy farmers across the district?
So I've been really strong in agricultural issues, being from the western part of the district, which has a ton of farmers and a lot of the dairy farms that are here. One of the biggest things those farmers tell us is that, they have family farms, maybe 40, 50 cows, and they've been operating in the red year after year because we've seen large collectives that have sprung up that have taken away their business and haven't allowed them to really produce the milk that they need to. So there's a couple things I would say. I would say that these large collectives need to be busted up. We've almost seen a monopoly come from these individuals. And I say the same thing for the tech industry. I think our tech industry has gotten so large that we also need to bust those up. But one of the big things that I say is that there is a insurance plan for our farmers and for our dairy farmers in particular. A federal plan where those farmers pay in year after year, and an insurance program that barely pays out. It's a subsidy program. And the fact that we haven't seen a significant payout for these farms is very troubling. Because we used to have a really good insurance program that worked, but as Congress changed the laws and made this into a more pay-as-you-go kind of program, we've seen more and more issues. So I'd say first and foremost, we need to focus on revitalizing that program, completely revamping it. And second, I'm really concerned about the rate of suicides for our dairy farmers. Because of these issues, collectives taking over their farms and shutting those down, we have a high rate of suicide, especially here in New York State. So we want to make sure that our family farms are really protected by that, and that there is counseling available to them. Not only dairy farms, but farmers across the nation. I think they need that resource to work together in order to keep their farm surviving.
Now, the insurance program, let's say that's more on the back end, but
Sure.
what about prices in particular? How could Congress work with the dairy lobby being in Washington and a strong force in Washington?
Sure.
We have just passed the Farm Bill. I say we as though I'm in Congress, but Congress did just pass the Farm
Absolutely.
Bill. But how would you address prices? If you could just pass a bill on your own,
Sure.
how would you address pricing for
Sure.
dairy?
Well, I think that we need to talk to the industry. I think that's really important. And, I'm not so keen on saying that we need to start to set prices because I don't want to necessarily do that. But we need to talk about what are all the factors that are going into our pricing, right? Because when you look and you buy a bottle of milk, you're talking about making sure that we've got a dairy farmer who's getting the milk, and then we're shipping it off to processing plants, and then from the processing plants to shipping companies. Now, the dairy farmer's getting less and less, but the processing and the shipping get the same cut, even as prices fluctuate. So my focus would be on regulating those the processing and the shipping, because somewhere along the line, we need to make sure our farmers get the adequate cut that they need in order to keep running their farms.
And shifting gears to another
Sure.
topic, immigration.
Yeah.
Especially over the last week with Congress trying to move forward on immigration bills.
Yeah.
And the latest issue, of course, being family separation at the border.
Yeah.
We have really seen in the last few months all the different facets to the immigration issue. Narrowing that scope to the 23rd District.
Sure.
What part of the immigration debate do you think is most poignant to your potential constituents across the district? And what would you do to address that?
Well, I know you say we're shifting gears, but I think immigration goes into agriculture, right? Because we have a need for migrant labor. And we really do need to have an immigration reform that allows us to get the temporary work visas to allow our migrants to help work our farms. And what we've seen is just shifting policy overall. A need for immigration reform means we've got to put up a wall, or it means that, we can't compromise, is what we're hearing from Congress right now. Well, that's not good enough for the people here. You talk to our farmers, they say they need migrant workers. They want immigration reform that allows them to keep going, but that's not what we're getting. In addition, we're seeing ICE raids in a lot of parts of our district. We've got families that are here that are afraid to even step out of their house because they're doing roundups, especially in Yates County. And that's simply unacceptable for what we have here in this district. I'd say the bigger issue that we're also talking about is dreamers. We've got dreamers that are attorneys, doctors, family friends. They're across our district and across this nation, and we haven't done anything about that. In fact, we've held them hostage as part of our immigration reform. That is unacceptable.
Now, you mentioned compromise in there.
Sure.
In a situation, the House will be taking up the leadership bill next week, but in a situation where you would be faced with something, for example, voting on a border wall in exchange for other parts of an immigration plan, for example, maybe a workers program, just a hypothetical.
Sure.
Would you be willing to compromise and come to the other side and work out a compromise deal?
Absolutely, Vaughn. I mean, I think that's the biggest problem that we have with Congress right now, is that we used to be able to send our statesmen and women up to Congress and then allow them to argue both sides, compromise, and still have dinner with each other at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. We've not seen that in a very long time. Instead, we've seen politics that has become completely polarized. Mm-hmm. You know, do I think we absolutely need to compromise? But that compromise needs to be representative of what the people here in the 23rd District want.
Mm-hmm. But when you come back and say you are talking to students at Cornell,
sure,
or immigrants coming into the district, workers on a dairy farm,
mm-hmm.
and you said you had to come to the table and do a compromise bill that included border security and funding for a wall.
Sure.
Are you confident you could have that discussion with a constituent and explain, and they would understand why you came to the table on that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that as both a former teacher and an attorney, my entire life has been about explaining things, breaking things down, and talking about rationale. I think what we don't get from our current congressman is that. You know, oftentimes he holds town halls and tells us, hey, this is what I'm doing, but doesn't give us a rationale or doesn't even listen to the people at the town halls. You know, there was a town hall recently in Enfield that talked about how horrible the farm bill would be for single mothers and for farmers. And instead, we saw him voting for the farm bill, not even listening to those individuals. And he voted, obviously, more than once to pass that farm bill. Mm-hmm. So, yes, I'm confident that if we had to make that compromise, that I'd be able to go and talk to the people that are here and explain why, right? I think most people are rational and want to just know why you vote the way you did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. And we're just going to keep moving down the
Please
line
do.
with policy issues.
All right.
And the hard ones, too. Second Amendment.
Sure.
Just in the course of this campaign, we've had Parkland, Las Vegas, and as well as the continued daily issue surrounding the Second Amendment, the argument, the conversation surrounding the Second Amendment. Where do you stand right now, and has that changed over the last year?
So my stance on Second Amendment rights has not changed. Mm-hmm. I know we sat down a year ago and we talked about guns, right? Mm-hmm. I grew up hunting and I grew up learning how to safely and responsibly use a gun. But, you know, obviously the national attention on guns has changed. I will say the one thing we didn't talk about a year ago is the idea of arming teachers. You know, as a former teacher, I can't imagine having a side piece on my hip while I go around talking to my students. You know, and I think most teachers don't approve of that either. But more importantly, there are things that most people do agree upon. Mm-hmm. Things like having a universal background check. You know, making sure that we understand who's getting our guns. But as long as we're safe and responsible, I think that's the most important part of it.
Mm-hmm. To clarify, would you support an assault rifle ban?
I think we need to first off define what a military-style grade weapon is, mm-hmm. and then once we do that, I would support that. Mm-hmm. Because most of our hunters, especially in this district, don't use a rifle to hunt.
Mm-hmm. And again, almost like the immigration debate,
sure.
The Second Amendment debates and conversations that we've already seen get highly polarized.
Sure.
An example being the Fix NICS concealed carry reciprocity bill that was brought up in Congress. If you were put to a vote, just an example being concealed carry reciprocity Fix NICS,
sure.
Would you be prepared to compromise and maybe vote for a measure that contained a part that you didn't like?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it depends on what you're compromising for, mm-hmm. right? I mean, there are some things, if the majority of the people here in the district don't want it, well, I'm representing those people, mm-hmm. right? I mean, I think we've got a representative now that says, you know, he will vote his conscience and vote whatever he decides on. For me, I take a different tact. I take the tact that a representative is accountable to the people. And so if the majority of the people don't want it, we're not doing it, right? I think that's an important difference between both Representative Reed and I.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right. Healthcare.
Sure.
Just keep moving right along.
Please do.
Healthcare. Very important issue and a very dynamic issue across the district mm-hmm. with more rural areas.
Absolutely.
And rural healthcare. What are some parts of the ACA that you would consider mandatory to protect? Which would be on the top of your list to protect? We've seen a lot of changes to the ACA.
Yeah. So the top thing to protect is making sure that we've got the markets available and affordable to individuals. I would say making sure that we codify the payments to insurance companies, because that does allow us to reduce the cost. And I think what we've seen is an administration holding that hostage. And what you've seen is exactly what everyone thought, that premiums would rise. I mean, you're looking at a rate premium in New York going up astronomically next year because they're saying they can't afford to survive. And so I would say those are the top things. In addition, I would say pre-existing conditions, right? We have a representative who has voted to completely gut the Affordable Care Act 63 times.
So pre-existing conditions are one of the things you would stand to protect.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's an important part of the bill, making sure that we have those. Ultimately, I'm a big supporter of a Medicare for All solution. So I really do think that we need to have a complete overhaul of our healthcare system.
Do you think that's possible?
I think so. Absolutely.
Given the current Congress?
Well, the current Congress is different. I would say that if you are trying to get a Medicare for All bill in the current Congress, no. But luckily, we've got more people running than ever in Congress, running for Congress right now, that really is focusing on that. And as we start to move forward through the elections, I think you're going to see people being elected that do support that.
But you definitely face opposition in the Senate, would you not?
For now, I think there would be some opposition in the Senate. But, I do believe that there are senators out there that do want to see this. And if the bill is properly written, that you could get something through.
Circling back to the ACA, are there parts that you would get rid of from the ACA that currently exist? Changes you would make?
Sure. So, I think that the ACA provided more insurance to folks than ever before. I think that it hasn't really gone far enough. So I think some of the changes would be expanding the marketplaces and probably bringing them under a more unified control. I think what we saw was a bill that was a compromise from a lot of different perspectives and ended up being more of a Republican bill than anything else. So being able to expand the marketplaces and also being able to bringing them under more centralized control, I think would be a better option.
Now I want to dig into the campaign a little bit.
Sure.
Over the last week, your campaign released some information about another candidate, Tracy Matrano, and an issue regarding her residency. In a general sense, what persuaded you to release that information?
So I will say I've been across the campaign, I've always said that we need to make sure that we have a government that's transparent, accountable, and responsive. And so for any Democratic nominee, no matter who they are, we want to make sure that they're accountable. I've been proud to be the only candidate to release the tax returns to show, hey, this is what we've got. No other candidate has done so, even though we've called them to do so. Ms. Matrano had some questionable things in her past, and some things that do have some serious legal ramifications. And I simply raised those things and asked her to respond. And I don't think I got an adequate response yet.
Some people viewing the primary might see this as Democratic infighting. Do you think it is that serious? How do you respond to those kind of allegations?
Well, my response is pretty simple. If we have it, then Tom Reed has it. And primaries are incredible opportunities to address the issues that candidates have. It's not Democratic infighting when you're just asking questions. And that's what we tried to do.
Now, looking forward, just to wrap up,
sure.
Should you not win the primary, would you support another candidate should they win?
Absolutely. I've said all along that I think our ultimate goal is defeating Tom Reed. So it's important that we unify against or behind any candidate that wins the primary.
And would you consider running as an independent at this point?
No, I would not do that. I know that there are some candidates that have suggested that, but I would not do that, no.
All right. Eddie, thank you so much again for sitting down and taking time out of your Saturday before the primary to answer some questions. Really appreciate it, and it was a pleasure
Thanks so much,
working with you so far.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right.